tray line disappears into steam at 4 a.m., and the person moving fastest through it has never worked in a professional kitchen before in their life. No restaurant resume, just orders and a demanding pipeline of recruit training and culinary instruction standing between them and feeding thousands of sailors aboard a warship. What does it actually take to turn a recruit with no cooking background into someone trusted to keep an entire warship fed, healthy, and combat ready? If by the end of this video you understand why the Navy calls this one of the most demanding jobs on the ship, type proud in the comments. The real enemy on a carrier galley is not hunger. The enemy is scale, and the enemy is time, because a mistake that would ruin one dinner party on land can hospitalize hundreds of sailors with no hospital within 1,000 miles. Most people look at a Navy cook and see someone flipping burgers for a crowd. What they miss is that a single contaminated batch of food, scaled to feed a crew, is not an inconvenience. It is a mission readiness event that can pull an aircraft carrier out of the fight. The Navy continually trains new culinary specialists to sustain food service operations across the fleet. What happens when you hand that responsibility to an 18-year-old who has never cracked more than a dozen eggs at once? A single Nimitz-class carrier galley produces somewhere around 17,000 to 18,000 meals a day for a crew of over 5,000 sailors. That is the equivalent of running roughly a dozen mid-sized restaurants simultaneously, non-stop, with 0 closing hours and 0 nights off. Sailors eat breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a fourth meal called midrats, built specifically for the crew working through the night. Every dish depends on a supply chain stretching from shore warehouses onto the ship, across open ocean, into deep storage decks below the waterline. Industrial equipment on board handles 80 gallons of soup and 60 pounds of dough in a single batch, numbers that would be unthinkable in almost any civilian kitchen. That is the equivalent of a small brewery-sized soup kettle feeding not a shelter, but a floating city that cannot dock for resupply whenever it wants. Behind every one of those meals sits a training pipeline built to compress years of kitchen experience into a matter of weeks. And that pipeline is where the real story begins. Recruits who choose the culinary specialist rating start the same way every sailor does, at Recruit Training Command in Great Lakes, Illinois, before ever touching a stove and uniform. From there, they report to Culinary Specialist, a school run out of the Joint Culinary Center of Excellence at Fort Gregg Adams, formerly known as Fort Lee, Virginia. Published Navy descriptions list the Culinary Specialist, a school at 5 weeks in duration, covering food safety, nutrition, cooking, baking, and quantity food preparation. Course content and schedules can change. Think of it like a compressed culinary school semester, except failing a food safety lesson here does not cost you a grade. It can cost hundreds of shipmates a meal that makes them sick at sea, with no emergency room in reach. Old civilian line cooks learn one restaurant's menu over months. New Navy culinary specialists learn to scale any recipe from 100 servings to over 1,000 in a matter of weeks, a scaling advantage that has no true civilian equivalent. The seaman apprentice who burns a 60-pound batch of dough during training does not get sent home. He gets sent back to the mixer to try again before lights out. Sanitation and nutrition training is not a single lecture. It is a foundational block that determines whether a student even advances toward the kitchen floor. Instructors drill food safety because one outbreak on a deployed ship, far from any port, becomes a medical crisis rather than an inconvenience. Students also sit through uniform inspection, a detail that surprises outsiders who assume culinary training is only about food. Standards matter here. Students undergo rigorous, graded uniform and sanitation inspections before ever stepping near a stove, according to breakdowns of the course structure. Think of it like a health inspector visiting before every single shift, except the inspector is standing in the room the entire time. Civilian restaurants get inspected occasionally. Navy galleys operate under inspection standards baked into daily routine, a difference that is less about paperwork and more about survival at sea. The instructor who fails a sanitation check does not get thanked for it. The student just loses a day of training time they cannot get back. Techniques of cookery is where the actual cooking begins, split between lab instruction and hands-on practical exercises that run for hours at a stretch. Students then move into small quantity baking, another lab and practical combination, before finishing with culinary math, the discipline of converting recipes built for a handful of people into recipes built for a battalion. The curriculum is demanding. Courses documented in training breakdowns show techniques of cookery running in intensive multi-hour blocks of combined lab and practical work. Have you ever tried doubling a recipe for a dinner party and had it come out wrong? Now imagine multiplying it by a factor of 100 and getting it right the first time, because there is no second dinner to serve if the first one fails. That single skill, culinary math, separates a home cook from someone the Navy trusts to feed a warship. Before we go further, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. Over 98% of you watch without subscribing. It costs you nothing but makes a huge difference. Now, back to what happens when all of that classroom training finally meets a real kitchen. Galley Week is the single hardest stretch of the entire pipeline, and it is designed that way on purpose. Students take everything from sanitation to culinary math and apply it inside a kitchen environment built to simulate what they will face aboard an actual Navy vessel. Shifts start around 4 a.m., and instructors give zero room for error because the meals being cooked are real, served to real people on a real timeline. That is the equivalent of a culinary school final exam that runs 7 days straight with no retakes and hundreds of actual diners waiting at the end of the line. Old school kitchen training lets a student fail quietly and try again next semester. Galley Week does not offer that. A bad service means real sailors in training go without the meal they were promised. A 200-to-1 difference in consequence compared to a civilian culinary classroom. The student who oversleeps during Galley Week does not get a warning. He gets a galley full of hungry trainees and a supervisor watching every plate that goes out. Once graduates leave Fort Gregg Adams, they are assigned to their first ship and begin the real test, keeping a rotating 21-day menu system running for a crew that never stops needing food. Do you think you could cook the same complex menu cycle from memory, under time pressure, for 3 to 5 years straight? Let us know in the comments. That initial sea tour, a 3 to 5 year service commitment, with individual deployments running up to 9 months at a stretch, is the baseline expectation for every culinary specialist who reports aboard. Numbers matter here too. Thousands of sailors serve in the culinary specialist rating across the fleet at any given time, a relatively small community responsible for feeding the entire surface navy. Think of it like a national restaurant chain run entirely by a workforce smaller than a single mid-sized company, except failure anywhere in that chain means sailors go hungry on a ship that cannot pull into a drive-thru. The rating carries a 5-year, 60-month service obligation once fully qualified, a commitment few outside the Navy realize accompanies a job most people assume is just kitchen work. Storms do not pause the schedule, and neither does combat readiness, which means culinary specialists cook through rolling seas, general quarters drills, and around-the-clock flight operations without the galley ever fully shutting down. Contrast that with a civilian restaurant that closes for a hurricane warning. A Navy galley does not have that option because 5,000 people still need 3 meals and midrats no matter what the ocean is doing outside the hull. Culinary specialists assigned to submarines take an additional path, volunteering for a further stretch of basic enlisted submarine school in Groton, Connecticut, learning basic submarine systems on top of everything they already learned about food. That is the equivalent of a chef also being certified to operate emergency systems on the building they work in. Because on a submarine, everyone is cross-trained for survival, not just service. The culinary specialist who masters both roles does not get a title bump for it. She gets assigned to one of the most physically demanding and confined food service environments in the entire Navy. But here's the part nobody talks about. The advancement path for a culinary specialist runs parallel to something most viewers never consider: management. Senior culinary specialists do not just cook, they run entire food service operations, oversee junior sailors, manage inventory worth millions of dollars in provisions, and answer directly to supply officers for every pound of food that comes aboard. Chief Latara Moore, a career culinary specialist with over 22 years of service across carriers, cruisers, and destroyers, has described leading food operations for entire ships as fundamentally a leadership discipline wrapped inside a kitchen job. That is the equivalent of a restaurant line cook working their way up to regional operations director, except promotion here happens while deployed at sea, evaluated under conditions no civilian manager ever faces. The sailor who becomes a chief culinary specialist does not get a corner office. She gets a compartment below deck and a crew of 5,000 depending on every decision she makes about what goes on their tray. What the official training breakdowns do not fully capture is what happens to a person who spends years cooking in a windowless space below the waterline, waking before dawn, timing every meal around flight schedules and combat drills, rather than a clock on a wall. Culinary specialists rarely appear in the footage of fighter jets launching off a flight deck, yet nothing on that flight deck happens without a crew that ate breakfast an hour earlier. The cost of that invisibility is real. No ceremony, no combat medal, just a clean galley and an empty tray line that quietly signals the mission succeeded again. These are the sailors standing over 80-gallon soup kettles and industrial mixers, so the rest of the crew can fly, fight, and sleep under the readiness that food security actually provides. If this video changed the way you see the people behind a Navy tray line, subscribe now. The story of what it actually takes to feed 5,000 sailors at sea is still being written on carriers deployed right now.